Hold up.
Cameras rolling. And action.
You know what it's like. Gotta get ready to get ready sometimes. Sometimes you ain't ready. You just gotta get ready. Gotta pick everything up, put everything around. It's like, you know how, you ever notice how when people getting ready to do an athletic performance, a a foul shot, or a penalty kick, or you see Olympic weightlifters kind of do their work, or now everybody sees powerlifters now, so they see powerlifters set up for their deadlift, and they have a certain way that they kind of do things beforehand. It's kind of like that before you have people come over your crib, before you start talking about specific things. You might have a way of doing a thing that kind of sets you up for it. That's kind of like this. And like, you want to prepare, right? And you want to have a system or a process. But you don't want to be so tied to it as to be like oppressive. Like if it doesn't get set up properly, you're all off. You kind of want to have just like a check-in, like you can just prepare. I think when you start getting into like too much of a rote systemization of a thing, that lends us to like certain ways of certain ideas and certain ways of thinking that produce these kind of one-way systems. You can only do it this way. No, you can do it so many different ways. You can show up in so many different ways of doing a thing. You can be particular and still be like almost like anarchist a little bit about it. If you want to think about it that way, I might get in the way for so many people, so I may not want to use that. But just like enough to produce a kind of comfort and to get also yourself confident about what's taking place without producing any kind of like anxiety about it. Because the task at hand already has enough, to use an overused term, anxiety with it. Or just like pressure to perform or to do a thing a specific way or to be excellent. And maybe some of the certain ways that we've gone about achieving excellence or appreciating skill is oppressive. You know what I'm saying? So just prepare, just enough, not too much. Don't go crazy. Coffee. All right, so what were we talking about? You remember? Oh, this ain't the right one. That's the right one. That's the good stuff. All right, what were we yammering on about before? Excellence, thinking, all the rest of that stuff. Being, thinking. So we were talking about that Daniel Kahneman piece, right? That book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. And like, so, you know, he wins a Nobel Prize in economics, but he's a psychologist, right? In particular, a social psychologist. And later on, he'll start calling what ends up being called behavioral economics, right? Years later. You know, they said this in the beginning, and the deal's the deal no matter what, but we'll get to that later. He says this in the beginning, this is social psychology. But like they didn't have a framework for understanding that and all of those things at that time, that way, the way that he's explaining it. And where it applies, where we're raised, schooled, all the rest of those things, where it makes money is in economics. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of the point. This is the underlying principle by which he would go about winning, you know, being honored with the Nobel, right? These Swedish cats being like, you smart. There's two ways of thinking. One way, and the word thinking is kind of like my big misnomer in the whole statement, but we'll use that because that's the way he explains it. There's two ways of thinking, or arriving at a response. We have the first way, which can be exemplified by 2 + 2 = 4. 4 + 4 = 8. 8 + 8 = 16. And boom, like you can ask most people on the street this question, right? Snaps, they just hit you back with it, right? But you say 72 times 79, and they're like, I don't know. Or if they're cool and they really get it, they'll be like, I'm gonna have to think about that. And this begins like probably your system 2 thinking. And the idea being that this is the beginning of where thinking would occur. because you actually have to stop for a moment and use the faculties of your brain that require you to calculate a thing and to come up with what would be your proposed solution based upon your method of arriving at a response. Or dare we say an answer, because it satisfies the question that's being asked. Cool. The first method, thinking one, is kind of how we're schooled, trained, how we're brought up in this country, specifically United States, right? I can speak from this perspective clearly because I was raised in it. Most of us that are, if you're United States, you're raised in it. Rote memorization and regurgitation of information that has been given. We have not gone through the process at all of actually thinking about the two and the two and that creating the four. Where did this two come from? Why did we have one to begin with? All of these different things actually fare into what would cause this thing to happen. Under system one, we're using the least amount of energy. Our brains are using the least amount of sugar, glucose in the body as possible, right? We're not doing anything that's going to require any strenuous behavior, any strenuous thinking. System two, that's 72 times 79, I need to stop. Because that's going to require thinking. That's going to require calculations. That's going to require more energy on behalf of the brain. Now, understanding science, we say this is a brain thing, right? This is a function, pipes and wires. But in actual fact, we can start thinking about these as ways that we've been schooled and trained to do this thing. We haven't actually gotten to that point of schooling or training that produces a comfortability with thinking hard, thinking long, thinking deep. Thinking calculations and with the possibility of being in error. That last part, the possibility of being in error, of being incorrect, inaccurate, or just plain wrong, creates this wall between memorization and regurgitation, system one, real quick. System two, I'm gonna have to stutter, I'm gonna have to stammer, I'm not gonna look good, I might be wrong. All of these other, what we would call anxieties, or all these other pressures show up. So when there's variables in place, a lot of times what helps to bridge that gap between just mindlessly regurgitating what we've known to be the right answer versus thinking about something deeply, long, and to possibility be in error with our conclusion, we might create, kind of like vacuuming the rug, a process, something in place to prepare ourselves for the process to engage in thinking. Drinking my coffee in the morning, the way in which you set up and do your rituals in the morning, the way in which you set up your rituals when you get into the office, the way in which we ritualize or habituate ourselves to anything that's going to require us to actually think deeply. Some of our jobs don't require us to think deeply, and we actually have to go through the process of being okay with just not having to do any of that. And just systematizing and doing the thing over and over again. Oftentimes, this is where we get into a lot of arguments with folks, is because we've not prepared for thinking deeply about something that they're just spitting as regurgitated fact. And when that gets challenged, that's going to force us into thinking, and we have no agreement to do that thinking yet. Because everything about the way in which we've been groomed for the past 18 years has meant that facts are facts. All I gotta do is memorize it, regurgitate, and I'll be right, and I can rely on that. The minute that fact gets challenged, now I've got to think. And now there might be something else that comes up, something else entirely. 2 plus 2 equals 0. What? The second 2 is a negative 2. Oh, right. Negatives. That's right. Of course. Duh. We're almost into thinking, but we had a halt to our just that immediate confidence of like, hold on, 0. And some folks are real slick because they'll be just like, oh, I know the right answer because they've seen it before. That's still not thinking. The thing we call thinking and the thing that is valuable about, and before we even get into critical thinking and possibilities of like a critical theory or critical theories, occur in spaces where we have agreements to be safe enough, to be brave enough, to be okay with being in error, being incorrect, possibly being wrong entirely, so that we might do something important called learn. And I got onto this just because we were talking about learning and like how if you learn a thing one way, one particular way, that's not learning it. That's still just that's just memorization and regurgitation. Did you memorize this process? Did you memorize this way of doing things correctly? The way in which I told you to do it. Cool. What have you learned? I've learned nothing about one. I've learned nothing about how one to connect it to another one equals 2. So therefore now I've arrived at 2. We've done none of that. You haven't learned the angles by which this thing occurs. So that way I can think deeply about the ways in which it might occur differently. There is going to be variation. There is going to be wild difference. There is going to be something more subtle, such as a distinction in between the two, that separates them from being exactly the same. It's the reason why you'll hear me use often words like things are the same, and then there are things that are similar. They are not the same. There is a distinction between those two. Everybody wants nuance until nuance walks in the fucking room. What else you want to talk about? Have you ever been listened to when you want to be heard? When the whole point of what's going on is to be heard, not to be listened to. And vice versa. You're being heard, you're being felt, but nobody's listening to what you're saying. They're feeling what you're putting down, but they're actually not listening to the words of what you're saying. And they might be feeling an energy that's not present in the words that you're saying. When somebody's listening to somebody, they're usually listening for something. If I'm listening to a song, I'm listening for the ways in which the lyrics may occur, or the way in which the production may have happened. I may be listening to the ways in which the edits occurred, whether or not they meant to include the background noise, or whether or not that background noise was applied, or whether or not that was an error that they just kind of went with, or they're not even present for it. Being listened to is kind of like an interview, or a date, or hang out with somebody that might possibly be a friend one day. You're listening to and listening for certain things that might signal safety or might signal potential harm. There's a benefit to listening to and listening for. There's a benefit to being listened to and listened. But these mostly take place in private spaces. Private spaces. Good Lord. Public spaces. That idea of being listened to. Places where like profession or your personal public self is important. It's trying to protect you. If I'm talking to one of my really good friends and they're listening to me, I don't need you to listen. What the fuck you listening to me for? I need you to hear me. I need you to feel what I'm saying. I need you to hear. I possibly need you to do both. If you're one of my friends, we made it this far, you're gonna be doing both. You're gonna be listening to what I'm saying, and you're gonna be listening to how you feel. You're gonna be hearing how you feel. How the words made you feel. This happens a lot with poetry. Something deeply private made public. This happens a lot with art and movement. I'm not looking or listening for. I can be looking to the technical attributes of like a dancer, but there's something about that movement that hits me and allows me to feel something, that allows me to inquire about that feeling and why it made me feel that way. Why I allowed myself to feel that way. When I'm hanging out with my friends, we know something's happened when all of a sudden a conversation of hearing and listening becomes solely listening. This is usually the challenges that begin argument, and not the good kind of argument, the argument that like dissolves friendships or estrange them at particular frayed ends. If relationships are kind of like threads combined to make ropes that bind together, there's always going to be these frayed edges. It just happens over time. Threads give out. And we create new threads. Or we go and try to reconnect them. Sometimes them knotting together makes a tighter thread. But that happens at the level of hearing and listening, not one or the other. Empathy shows up with hearing. I'm not listening for anything. I'm hearing you. You're heard. Your words are felt. That energy, that vibration, how you're showing up, how you're feeling is felt. Not exactly as to be listened to prescriptively. I remember when this happened to me. But even when somebody says, I remember when this happens to me, if you're being heard, that's being heard. You dig? It kind of all comes, it not all comes back, but those kind of connect to one another, right? That system 1, system 2, thinking, which will change that to thought versus thinking. So thought being the facts that you've regurgitated, there's no thinking about 2 + 2 = 4, but there's thinking about 72 times 79. When I'm listening, I know the right answers already. When I'm hearing, there's something more complex going on. Not complicated, just complex going on. That requires that maybe what's coming in, there's something more behind it. There's something more with it. What's that line from the Black Star album? where he says, I'm asking if y'all with me, and the crowd left me stranded in a public space desiring to be heard. And the crowd isn't doing their job. We feel that a lot of times in relationships when we're emotionally venting. There's a buildup and we're off-gassing. And the person that we're talking to, the audience, isn't necessarily doing their job. It's kind of leaving us stranded. And hopefully it's only momentarily till they realize, oh shit, that's what's happening. I need to hear my friend. I need to hear my significant other. I need to hear my partner. I need to hear these people. There's something about when you bring those two things up, thought versus think, or thought and think, not versus. These aren't in competition. These are beneficial. It's just we're stuck on one side of it as if they don't go together. I think that's that's when I think about it. I think that's part of a lot of the problems is not necessarily this versus that. Oh, I don't listen, I hear people. No, they're both beneficial. They go together. It's just our fear about being wrong about what we heard, our fear about being wrong about what we think, getting in the way and producing this chasm that like strains this. Oh, I didn't know you were venting. I'm so sorry. Blah. Why don't you just say that? We start turning back. It's kind of like getting somebody's name wrong or getting their pronouns incorrect. I don't need you to flog yourself and I'm just letting you know. I'm venting. I've already gotten to the point where we're cool because I'm telling you, if I didn't care about you, I wouldn't have said anything and kept it moving because this ain't the place. Ain't it something how it makes me think about this ain't the place to exist. And not physically, corporally, as in your being of self, but this ain't the place to exist as you. There's so many the majority of the world is not a place to exist as you are. As you identify, as you articulate yourself, as you receive and express emotions. Most of the world is not constructed. When I say most, I'm just saying that because there's, you have home, hopefully. But most of the world is not constructed for you to exist as you are. Most of the world is constructed for you to exist within a very tight set of particular parameters that allow for you to be a single thing. To either be a thought listener or a thinking hearer. Not to be one who does both. Who is complete in those ways. Kind of like the space between the bookends. Most of the world is not constructed for us to be fully expressed in our identities. And yet there is a struggle against that. The struggle that we're going through right now is against that. There is a demand to exist in the permutations that allow for others to exist completely and fully without this fear that produces this hostility to learning the facets, the many different angles. Not the right or wrong, but like the dodecahedron of the sides. That 12-sided object. Like how many different ways? How many different ways can I execute a squat? How many different ways can I bake a cake? How many different ways can I put maple syrup on different objects and make them delicious? There's so many. But like, I don't know. Let me pause there. Yeah.